Hello, everyone, and welcome. Today, we're going to be talking about Chapter 2, which is Wealth and Poverty, the United States and Global Economic Inequalities. An overview of this chapter is going to include things like social stratification. This refers to the hierarchical arrangement of large social groups based on their control over basic resources. Stratification in the United States, which is based on the class system, is linked with global systems of stratification that affects people's life chances. A person's position in a class system is determined by wealth, power, and prestige that the person has. Stratification also exists on a global basis. Countries around the world can be categorized as high, middle, or low income nations. The high income nations, including the United States, account for 86% of the world's gross domestic product, or the goods or services that are produced. Among the aspects of the United States class system that sociologists study are the classes themselves and the class-based distribution of people by age, race, ethnicity, sex, and household composition. Sociologists also study the consequences of living in poverty and wealth, including differences in health and nutrition, housing, and education. Explanations for poverty and wealth include cultural or structural aspects and differ depending on the sociological perspective used to examine the problem. And remember, the main sociological perspectives that we're focusing on are functionalist, conflict, and symbolic interactionist. By the end of this lesson, you will be able to define global stratification and distinguish among high, middle, and low income nations. You'll be able to describe the division in the United States class structure and explain how wealth inequality differs from income inequality. You'll be able to discuss how the poverty line is determined and describe how some people are at greater risk of poverty than others. You'll also examine how poverty affects health and nutrition, housing, education, and other social resources in a nation. You'll be able to describe the origins of social welfare in the United States and give examples of programs in the quote-unquote welfare state. You'll be able to discuss 3 explanations for poverty and analyze the strengths and limitations of each, and identify possible solutions to the poverty problem using the functionalist conservative, conflict liberal, and symbolic interactionist approaches. So first, let's do an introduction to wealth and poverty. Described by many as, quote-unquote, the land of opportunity, America is one of the world's most prosperous nations, but at the same time remains a dramatic disparity between the lives of the wealthy and poor Americans. Sociologists study what is called the class system and its influence on wealth, poverty, and the inequality in the United States and abroad. A central characteristic of class system is social mobility, which is the upward or downward movement in the class structure that occurs during a person's lifetime and from one generation to another. So, how does this impact global stratification or the unequal distribution of wealth on a global basis? Well, in the United States, we look at the class system, but in other countries, they are considered high, middle, or low class, low income nations based on how the distribution of wealth occurs. Again, 86% of countries fall in the high income nation, but that means that the other 14% are middle and low income nations, meaning that they don't have a lot of gross domestic product that they sell, so they don't have enough income coming in. When we think of wealth, this is the value of an individual or family's economic assets. That impacts what class system in the United States they're going to be in. This is calculated at the basis of the value of property and financial assets, minus any debts that are owed. So the value of property could be the home you live in, financial assets could be what you have in savings or in stocks, and minus any debts. So that could be the mortgage on your house or any credit card debt or student loan debt that you have. Those at the top own the most wealth in the United States. Again, we also talk about life chances. This is the extent to which individuals have access to important societal resources, including food, shelter, and medicine, and water. When sociologists examine global stratification and inequality, they frequently focus on the quality of life indicators. Again, we just talked about wealth, income, life expectancy, health, the treatment of women, and education for high, middle, and low income nations. High income nations are highly industrialized, are technologically advanced, and have relatively high levels of national and per capita income. These would include countries like Australia, Canada, Japan, and the United States. Middle income nations are undergoing transformation from primarily agrarian to industrial economies and have many people who work the land. The national and per capita incomes remain relatively low. These countries would include Colombia, Panama, and Romania. Low-income nations are primarily agrarian and have little industrialization and low levels of national and personal income. These would include countries like Rwanda, Cambodia, Bangladesh, and Nicaragua. Comparisons between nations reflect the growing gap between the rich and the poor, both within and among nations. Disparity in life chances between high and low income nations are apparent. These life chances are the extent to which individuals have access to important societal resources like food, clothing, shelter, education, and healthcare. Poverty, hunger, life expectancy, crime, infant mortality, and rapidly growing populations are pressing problems in many low-income nations. Affluent people typically have better chances than the less affluent. Today, more than 1.3 billion people live in absolute poverty, which is often life-threatening. People may suffer from chronic malnutrition or die from hunger-related diseases. More than 600 million people suffer from chronic malnutrition, and 40 million people annually die from hunger-related diseases. Even those who do not live in absolute poverty often experience hardships based on relative poverty, a condition that exists when people can afford basic necessities such as food, clothing, and shelter, but cannot maintain an average standard of living in comparison to that of other members of their society or group. Experts project that the population of middle and low income nations will increase by almost 60% by the year 2025. That's 5 years away, y'all. And compared to an increase of about 11% in high income nations, thus compounding existing problems and increasing inequality on a global basis. According to the new International Division of Labor perspective, the disparity between high and low income nations results from the fact that workers in low income nations primarily produce goods for export to the high income nations. This global assembly line provides multinational corporations with low cost, primarily female labor, no corporate taxes, and no labor unions or strikes. So, something to think about is that when we think of world hunger, food losses, and food waste, this is a contributor to food insecurity. What you see before you are carrots and potatoes that have been thrown away because they were imperfect or they started to rot. Let's analyze class inequality in the United States. One of this country's most persistent social problems is that the United States has a high degree of social stratification. Today, the gap between the rich and the poor in this nation is wider than it has been in half a century. Throughout the world, the wealthiest and poorest people are living in increasingly separate worlds. Most contemporary research on class is influenced by the theories of Karl Marx and Max Weber. Marx's means of production model says that capitalist societies are divided into two classes: the capitalist class that owns the means of production and the working class that sells its labor power to the capitalists. According to Marx, inequality and poverty inevitably result from the exploitation of workers. Weber's multidimensional model says that economic factors are important in determining class location and studying social inequality, but other factors are also important. The model focuses on the interplay of wealth, power, and prestige, also sometimes referred to as status, as determinants of people's class position. Power is the ability to achieve goals despite opposition from others, and prestige is respect, esteem, or regard accorded to an individual or a group by others, again, often or sometimes referred to as status. According to sociologist Eric Wright, placement in the class structure today is based on the ownership or control of the means of production, purchase of others' labor, control of others' labor, and the sale of one's own labor. Accumulation of wealth provides opportunities for people in ways that earned income alone does not, and disparities in wealth across the lines of race and ethnicity are prevalent in the United States. Consider, for example, that the median wealth for white families in 2013 was about $141,000, as compared to Latinos at about $13,700 and African Americans at about $11,000. African Americans continue to have fewer chances to accumulate wealth than white Americans because whites, especially well-off whites, have had many years to amass assets and pass them on from generation to generation, whereas African Americans have not. African Americans have experienced the cumulative effects of racial discrimination as evidenced in inadequate schooling, high unemployment rates, low wages, and higher rates of certain types of crime. So the extreme wealth that we have, they're often the richest people in the world. They have a life of ease and luxury, and they donate to a lot of philanthropic causes. But the disparities that we have, as we just talked about, impact race and ethnicity. When we look at the income, this is the economic gain that's derived from wages, salaries, income transfers, or ownership of property. When we look at income transfers, this includes things like governmental aid, such as the temporary assistance for needy families known as TANF. The top 20% of households earned more than half of the nation's aggregate income in 2005. The top 5% alone received more than 20% of aggregate income. Median income for African Americans and Latinos and Latinas remain far behind the median income for white households. This figure here looks at the share of aggregate income between in 1980 versus 2015. As you can see, that middle 20% is shrinking, so is the next to lowest 20% and the lowest 20%. But what we've seen an increase in is the next to highest 20% and the highest 20%. So these are people who continue to be impacted with their aggregate incomes. Divisions in the U.S. class structure is prevalent in the United States. The United States has a number of class divisions which have largely remained unchanged since the post-World War II era of the 1950s. So let's talk about what these mean. The upper or capitalist class is the wealthiest and most powerful class of investors, heirs, and executives. Some members have investments in income-producing property such as media conglomerates, high-rise hotels, apartment buildings, and more. Others are presidents of major companies, sports or entertainment celebrities, or top-level professionals. The upper middle class is composed of professionals, that is, physicians, attorneys, business analysts, and corporate managers who do not own the means of production but have substantial control over production and other workers. The middle class includes white-collar office workers, middle management personnel, and persons in support positions such as medical technologists, nurses, legal or medical secretaries, and non-retail sales workers. The working class is comprised of persons who work as semi-skilled machine operators in industrial settings and non-manual semi-skilled positions such as daycare workers, checkout clerks, cashiers, and fast food counter help. The working poor class is composed of those who work full-time in positions such as unskilled labor, seasonal or migrant agricultural jobs, or the lowest paid service sector jobs, but still remain at the edge of poverty. The chronically poor constitute about 20% of the U.S. population, but receive only 3.6% of overall U.S. income. The chronically poor include people of working age who are unemployed or outside the labor force and children who live in poor families caught in long-term deprivation. So here in figure 2.2, we look at the median U.S. household income by race and Hispanic origin between 1990 and 2015. And what we see is that there are increases, even slight, in median household incomes, but that could be based on monies that are received that also reflect the change of price in the cost of goods and services. But in 2010, they were all relatively low, and we've seen as we head into 2015 they have slightly increased. But over time, you find that those who are Black, Hispanic, often are at a lower rate of return and are at lower chances of being financially sound or stable as compared to white and Asian individuals. Something to think about is that in highly developed nations, rich and poor often interact or at least coexist. We might not see what many different classes are, but we know that they're there. This picture here looks at a number of wealthy white men who are checking out cars at a car show that are very expensive, and you see a Black woman who is cleaning the floor. So when we look at the class structure and the division, we're looking at someone who is part of the working class or the working poor class versus those who are in the upper middle class or even the upper class. The United States has had the highest poverty rate of any advanced industrial nation. The U.S. poverty rate declined over the last 4 decades from the mid-60s through the mid-2000s, but both the rate and the number of people living in poverty rose between 2006 and 2010. The poverty line is based on money, income, and cash government assistance programs such as Social Security payments. Social Security was established in 1965. In 1965, the poverty line was based upon the assumption that the average family must spend about 1/3 of its total income on food and was thus determined by a minimum family market basket. This is a low-cost food budget that contains a minimum level of nutrition for a family. So it's the number of family members multiplied by 3 to allow for non-food costs such as rent and utilities. The Federal Office of Management and Budget, or OMB, updates the poverty line annually. It's also adjusted for the number of people in the household. Many social analysts argue that the official poverty line is too low and that poverty thresholds should be increased by at least 50%. If I may just make a clarification, when we talk about the poverty line, when we talk about Social Security payments, Social Security Act was actually signed by President Roosevelt on August 14th of 1935. And it had several provisions for welfare as well as Social Security insurance programs that were designed to pay retired workers age 65 or older. After they retire, they get steady payments. In 1965, that's when the poverty line was established, and it was based upon the assumption that the average family must spend about 1/3 of its total income on food. And that's where OMB came up with being able to establish this. I just wanted to make that clarification. So who are the poor? Poverty isn't distributed equally. People in some categories are at higher risk for poverty than people in other categories. In order to look at this, we have to look at the feminization of poverty. This is the trend whereby women experience poverty at far higher rates than men. About 2/3 of all adults living in poverty are women. Households headed by women are the fastest growing segment of the overall population. In 2009, about 1/3 of all families headed by women were poor and nearly 15% lived in deep poverty. High rates of female poverty are related to women's unique vulnerability to event-driven poverty. Poverty resulting from the loss of a job, disability, desertion by a spouse, separation, divorce, or widowhood. Other factors include shifts in the nation's economy and demographic shifts such as childbearing outside of marriage and higher divorce rates. The term racial feminization of poverty describes the intersection of gender and racial inequalities in problems associated with poverty. Women of color, particularly Black women and Latinas, are especially disadvantaged by both the feminization of poverty and issues of racial inequality. The high rate of poverty among children is directly linked to poverty among women. Children under the age of 18, which accounts for about 24.3% of the U.S. population, account for more than 35% of the poor. In 2009, about 1 in 4 children under 6 were considered poor. When children under 6 live in households headed by women with no adult male present, 54% are poor. Despite fluctuations in poverty rates over time, Black, Latinos, Latinas, and Native Americans consistently remain overrepresented among people living in poverty in the United States. Black Americans make about 13.3% of the overall population, and about 24.1% of Blacks were among the official poor in 2015. This figure was similar to 21.4% of Latinos and Latinas, and sharply higher than 9.1% for non-Latino Latina whites, and 11.4% for Asian Americans. The poverty rates of 26.6% for Native American or American Indians and Alaska Natives is the highest of any racial group in the United States. Figure 2.4, look at people below the U.S. poverty level in 2015 by race. And you see that non-Hispanic white are the lowest, followed by Asian, followed by Hispanic, then Black Americans, and then Native American, American Indian, and Alaska Native. So you see that for non-Hispanic white and Asians, that there are gross disparities between those who are at or above the poverty line. Individuals and families in poverty don't have the chance to contribute to society, and in turn, they don't have access to the same privileges and opportunities as those who are more affluent. Poverty is related to health and nutrition disparities. Low-income individuals average fewer healthy days per year and have higher rates of infant mortality, greater prevalence of hypertension, diabetes, and other chronic diseases, and shorter life expectancy rates. Although the United States has some of the best high-tech healthcare facilities in the world, many people don't have access to them. Medicaid is the major source of healthcare coverage for people living in poverty. However, coverage is limited because many doctors do not accept this form of payment, and some patients can't afford to pay the initial deductible or copayment. More than 26% of all people earning below $25,000 per year are uninsured. Good nutrition depends on the food purchased, and when people are poor, they are more likely to go without food or to purchase cheap but filling foods such as bean, rice, potatoes, and these typically don't meet all the daily nutritional requirements. Because of increases in poverty and unemployment rates, food insecurity has increased. Food insecurity is the lack of consistent access to adequate food for active, healthy living. Adults who lack adequate nutrition are less able to work and are at greater risk of illness and disease. Children who lack adequate nutrition may be affected developmentally due to conditions like iron deficiency, anemia, poor socio-emotional development, rickets, scurvy, parasitic worms, and mental challenges such as intellectual disabilities. Housing. Many regions in the United States lack affordable, low-income housing. The problem is even greater for individuals and families living in poverty because of the number of low-cost housing units, which is decreasing. Some low-income housing is located in racially segregated areas, plagued by high crime rates, overcrowded conditions, inadequate heating and plumbing facilities, cockroach and rodent infestation, and dangerous structural problems due to faulty construction or lack of adequate maintenance. Shared housing situations are referred to as being quote-unquote doubled up, and economic hardship means that some people are staying with relatives for extended periods of time because they don't have the financial resources to go anywhere. Standard estimates place the homelessness population at between 1 and 1.3 million. The number of homeless families increased by about 30% between 2007 and 2010. Most researchers argue that homelessness is most often caused by poverty and job loss. Finally, we look at poverty and education. They're deeply intertwined. Children from low-income families tend to have inadequate educational opportunities that perpetuate their position at the bottom of the class system. They acquire fewer years of schooling and are less likely to graduate from high school or college than children from more affluent families. Schools located in high poverty rural areas or central cities are often dilapidated, have underpaid and overworked teachers, and use outdated equipment and teaching materials. So what we see here is that there are certain differences. When you look in cities with rapid urban and suburban growth patterns, low-cost housing units have been replaced by expensive condominiums or single-family residences for affluent residents. This is called gentrification. And as gentrification occurs, these more affluent families go into these lower-income neighborhoods, And while they may make a benefit to those neighborhoods that are plagued with things like crime, they're pushing people who are in poverty out of their homes. So where do they go? Many become homeless. Figure 2.5 looks at the percent of public school students in high poverty schools by race and ethnicity between 2012 and 2013. Something to note is that non-Hispanic, white, and Asians are grossly lower than Black, Hispanic, Pacific Islander, Native American, American Indian, or Alaska Native families. Two or more races is slightly above Asian, and many who are two or more races do have either white or Asian included in them. Let's look at welfare in the U.S. The initial wave of the U.S. welfare programs was established by President Roosevelt's New Deal in 1936 during the Great Depression. The Great Depression started in 1925 but continued well into the 1930s and marked the beginning of what we call the welfare state. The second wave of the welfare program began with the Economic Opportunity Act of 1964 and the War on Poverty programs that focused on education and vocational training for low-income children and adults to help them escape poverty. These programs included preschool education known as Head Start, compensatory education, and vocational training programs such as Job Corps, Neighborhood Youth Corps, and Manpower Development. These anti-poverty programs steadily reduced the percentage of people living in poverty. The Reagan and Bush administrations in the 1980s and early 1990s greatly reduced funding for AFDC, food stamps, subsidized housing, child nutrition programs, maternal and child health programs, family planning, and job training. Perhaps the most dramatic shift in the welfare policy came with the passage of a 1996 bill that abolished the federal guarantee of welfare benefits and gave states block grants to use as they wished to aid the poor. The law established a work requirement for most people seeking welfare and allowed states to set limits on how long recipients can receive benefits. The third wave of the welfare programs is somewhat different from the earlier ones in that it involves tweaking and attempting to fund existing welfare legislation. When we look at the ups and downs of Twitter as a tool for dealing with the problem of hunger, we look at this picture here, and this is Gwyneth Paltrow. She took up the challenge to raise $29 worth of food for a week, and some people on social media praised her while others criticized her. When we think about this, something for us to think about is that when we offer programs like this, are they truly beneficial? Who is collecting the money and who is receiving the money? The money that's collected, how much of it is taken out for things like paying online? You sometimes have to pay a percentage for using that online service. So how much money is taken out of that? For the people who are collecting the money, do they take a certain percentage out? So that $29 that you're trying to raise for one person for 1 week, they may only end up giving that person about $15 because the other $14 or almost 50% was then taken out for overhead costs and the use of different services in order to collect the money or to advertise to try to collect money. These are things that we need to think about. But also the fact too that we're going to Twitter to try to, and social media to try to deal with the problem of hunger is ludicrous. We are all paying taxes, yet there are programs that are available that some people may not know about. And there are programs each year that not only receive assistance, but don't receive enough, so now they have to go through private funding. The system around hunger is questionable. So are there actual explanations for poverty? Poverty can be explained in individualistic, cultural, or structural terms. Individualistic explanations for poverty are based on either 1, attitudinal and motivational problems of individuals that cause them to be poor, or 2, the amount of human capital, the assets a person brings to the labor market, such as education, training, experience, and specialized skills. And this is what a person possesses. To many sociologists, however, individual explanations of poverty amount to blaming the victim. Cultural explanations for poverty focus on how people's cultural backgrounds affect their values and behaviors. Anthropologist Oscar Lewis coined the term culture of poverty hypothesis, which holds that poor people develop a separate and self-perpetuating system of attitudes and behaviors that keep them trapped in poverty. More recent cultural explanations of poverty have focused on the lack of cultural capital, that low-income people do not have adequate cultural capital to function in a competitive global economy. Unlike individual and cultural explanations of poverty, which operate at the micro level, structural explanations of poverty focus on the macro level, the level of a social organization that is beyond an individual's ability to change. According to functionalists, social inequality serves an important function in society because it motivates people to work hard to acquire scarce resources, but changes in the economy have dramatically altered employment opportunities. Conflict theorists suggest that poverty is a side effect of capitalism. Corporate downsizing and new technologies have enhanced capitalist profits and contributed to the impoverishment of middle and low-income workers by creating a reserve army, those unemployed persons who are used by the capitalists as a source of cheap labor and a means to keep other worker wages low. So, is there a solution to poverty? The functionalist or conservative solutions to poverty include strengthening our major social institutions. By motivating low-income and poverty-level people to change their attitudes, beliefs, and work habits, they will have a better chance of escaping poverty. Conflict or liberal solutions to poverty suggest reducing racial and ethnic inequality, as well as economic inequality in our nation. Symbolic interactionist solutions to poverty suggest finding more constructive ways to think about poor people individually and better ways to envision what might reduce poverty at the social level. So my question for extra credit, which you can put in the bottom of the YouTube video below, do you believe that there's a solution to poverty? If so, do you align more with the functionalist, conflict, or symbolic interactionist perspective? I hope that this was helpful for you. As always, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, please feel free to reach out to me. Otherwise, I hope you have a great day, and we'll see you soon. Take care.